we saw the pictures earlier how when we put the acetates at 7.2 degrees each, we had Lord Paycal dying with a bird on his head with the bat mask across his face. Well, when we turn the acetates another 7.2 degrees, we now see Lord Paycal with a bat god. Here, there's the bat god, his two eyes, his head, and his arms. It looks like a 747 coming into land. And we have the god of death with his cloak. It's like a skeleton with its two eyes, his nose, his mouth. It's like a chimpanzee with a black hat on, with a cloak. This is the god of death on his mouth. On his head, we have the god of the north, Yeotl. And Yeotl has two skeletons, one in each hand, and he's standing on the guy's head. And there's a hole in Lord Paycal's head. But the reason the hole's there is to allow for the soul to leave the body on death. The Chinese did the same thing. This is a jade suit, a jade burial suit from China. And this is from the tomb of Prince Li Sheng, who came after Qin Shi Huangdi, the first emperor of China in 220 BC. And what we see is that there's a hole in his head to allow the soul to release. And his head, the platelets on his head contain the entire super science of the sun, which is what we were talking about earlier on, how the sun radiates radiation which impinges on the earth and all that stuff. Also, these two dragon heads, these two baby dragons, are very important because we'll find those on the Holy Grail if we get to it later on. Now, this picture of Lord Paycal dying, we had the two pictures of Lord Paycal earlier, the two heads. That was one of the heads, and the other one had a crack in the nose bridge, which I said was very important. Well, here we see the crack in the nose bridge area here. And what this is telling us, it's like breaking an egg. We've got, Lord Paycal's got this skeleton in his mouth, like two hooks, and he's got Lord Tezcatlipoca Yeotl, he's the god of the north, on his head. And he breaks open like an egg, if you can imagine an egg snapping. And his forehead opens at the crack that was on the head on the floor that we saw earlier. Now, you say, why haven't these pictures been seen earlier? Well, that is the acetates without the colours. So you can see the problems of why this could never have been done before we had the computer and the overhead projector. Now, the next sequence in the pictures is this one here. Oh, sure, okay. The next picture, when we rotate the acetates again, is we see the hole in the head here of Lord Paycal's skull. His skull is a black area now. These are the bones, these are the eye sockets here. Out of the crack in the nose bridge area comes this maiden, and she opens her legs, she points to her forehead with the compasses of the Freemasons, and she laughs and smiles. Out of her womb comes a baby with a pearl in its mouth with wings. That's its back legs and its bottom, and there's its two arms. And the baby spits out a pearl, and the pearl becomes two solar babies. There's two babies there that we saw earlier, the twins, Venus. You see that, I'm afraid it's the best we can do, but do you remember the two babies were from Mexico with a solar mark on their stomachs earlier? That's what these two are. And these tell us that they're joined at the navel by a star. So this is Venus. So this tells us that when Lord Paycal died, his soul, there we see his soul coming out of his head. We've got his eye, his nose, his mouth. There's his chin. And the bird is now carrying his soul. The bird's flapping its wings and carrying the soul out of the head. And in its mouth, the bird has the pieces of the jade mask. So there's an awful lot going on in this picture. This tells us that when Lord Paycal died, his soul went to heaven. It was carried by the Quetzal bird, the baby bird that was on his head, and he was reborn as Venus, the twins. So this tells us that Lord Paycal was Jesus. He was the rebirth of Venus. I am the bright and morning star. And this is why we have the pearl in the seashell. He was Venus in the heavens. Just like it says in Revelation, I am the morning star and the evening star. And again, if we just have a look at the sequence there, we see the skull, the picture's getting worse and worse as his body degrades, and he goes to heaven and is reborn. And other pictures on the amazing lid of Palenque tell us this is the Earth Mother, which is Coatlicue here, with the twins on Earth. So what we see is the two twins on Earth sucking and holding the nipples of the Earth Mother. Coatlicue had 1,000 nipples, and she had a necklace of hands and hearts. She was a god of birth and rebirth for the Maya, the mother goddess. And so we see that when Lord Pacal was reborn as Venus, the twins, he came back to Earth. And this is how we can reconcile instinct, because how does a bird know how to build its nest? This is a nest of swallows or martins. And they know how to build a nest because there were martins in the last life. How does a dog know how to round up sheep? Because he was a sheepdog in his last incarnation. And if we look at, this is a Magic Eye 3D picture that we see in the popular magazines. And if you stare at them, you can see other information. This has got the pyramids in this area here, but you can't see it until you stare at it. So somebody asked me a question during the break. How did they do this if they didn't have acetates? Well, the Egyptians have tried to tell us about this. Here we see Nefertiti with one eye and one eye missing from the museum. It's in Berlin now, actually. And she's telling us we can only see half the information. The same with Akhenaten, the so-called father of Tutankhamun. He's got one eye missing. It's telling us we can only see half the information. And we've got a left hemisphere and a right hemisphere. Now, we need acetates because we're stupid. We have to put one here and put them on top of each other. But the Mayans were so intelligent, they opened their left eye, like the Magic Eye picture, and stored the picture, just like this one. Then they opened their right eye and stored the picture, and then the brain overlapped the two sides. So they didn't need acetates. We're the ones who need acetates because we're stupid. Now, can the brain do this? Well, the brain can do this. There's a report of a girl in England called Vicky Wilmore, and she was 10 years old, and one day she had a headache, she got up in the morning, went to school, and everything she wrote was upside down and back to front. The only way the teacher could read her essays was to put a mirror to the side of it, and she could read it, and it was perfect. But it was the exact opposite of what it was the day before, and it stayed like that for 3 years. And so she fell off the chair while watching Manchester United, banged her head, and everything went the right way around again. And she's been fine ever since. So we know the brain can invert things and turn it upside down with no difficulty and regurgitate the information. And this is how, for many years, when I was doing the work from initially the Mayan prophecies in 1995, I thought, well, no human being could do this stuff. No, it's impossible. It must be a genius. And I considered the possibilities, and then I thought, maybe I've been making a mistake, because, I'm saying that the Mayas were very intelligent, but maybe the Mayas weren't very intelligent. Because could it be, I have been trying to tell people a story that goes something like this. For example, once upon a time in Israel, 2,000 years ago, everybody walked on the water. And everybody turned water into wine, and everybody healed the sick with their bare hands. And I thought, that's not really true, is it? But one man did those things in Israel 2,000 years ago. Perhaps there was one man among the Mayas who did that stuff 1,250 years ago. And then once I thought of that, and I started to look at the stories, many more stories, and unfortunately, you're not going to see very much because of the setup. But that was the mask covering the man in the tomb. And there are actually 3 dots on here, 1, 2, 3. There are 2 dots there, darker ones, 1, 2. There's a dot there, 1. There's a dot here. There's a bead in his mouth. So I thought, well, could these be markers of alignment, just like the amazing lid of Palenque? Was the amazing lid of Palenque the Rosetta Stone which taught me the rules? Once I'd found out the rules, could I now take other artifacts, turn them upside down, and line up the dots like that, and come out with the bat god? Now, again, it's not very clear on here, but there's the eye, the nose, He's got a bead in his mouth, and these 3 dots underneath are aligned. If I can just... See, I just can't see it because the resolution is so bad. But let me try again. Can you see the bat god in the middle area with his 2 ears sticking up? And he's got his tongue out, and he's got a big black bead in his mouth, and he's got a cloak, and under the bottom of the cloak here, he's got 4 triangles, which tells us he ruled the north, south, the west, and the east of the sky. Now, as I move these around, we come out with lots of other pictures. For example, when I line the 2 black dots up there, we come out with a small boy here with 2 eyes. He's got a helmet on. There's lots of pictures. These are very complex pictures. Let me try and get you another composite. Let's try that one. That's the same picture, but a bit brighter. Can you see the small boy now? He's got a feathered hat on. There's his eye, his nose, his mouth. He's got his tongue sticking out of his mouth, and there's actually a snake coming, a V, like the tongue of a snake. On his forehead, he's got the god of sacrifice, which is here, with 2 earrings, one on either side, with an eye, and he's got a lotus blossom on his forehead. Beneath the lotus blossom, we have a Buddha figure, cross-legged, praying. Now, this equipment is so bad, I feel embarrassed. You know, I'd rather say, come and stand behind me and look at this on the screen, because you'd appreciate it. I'm fighting a losing battle here, I'll tell you that now. But these are beautiful pictures, and this tells us that this boy wore a feathered hat in his previous life. And he's telling us he came to the throne at the age of 9. He was known as the feathered snake to his people. He was the eagle in the sky, the soul, and also the snake on the ground which shed its skin and reincarnated. He's telling us that he was Tutankhamun, the guy with the feathers and the snake on his forehead. He's telling us he was Buddha, cross-legged, praying. He's telling us he was the Lord of sacrifice. This is the picture at the back. And when we start... There's a sketch of the picture I'm trying to explain. And even that, again, it's very fuzzy because of the resolution of this thing. But here we have the Mayan god of fire and sacrifice called Xiahtikuhtli, also known as Xiapi Totec to the Mayas. And he has a brazier on his back, and they used to put people in the brazier and cremate them. So Xiahtikuhtli wore a helmet to keep the heat off his head. Here we see the small picture of the boy is wearing a helmet. It's telling us he is Xiahtikuhtli, the small boy Xiahtikuhtli, the god of sacrifice. And it's telling us he was a feathered snake. He's got the feathered snake coming out of his mouth here. He's telling us that he used to pray cross-legged beneath a lotus blossom. And he's telling us that he was a feathered snake of Egypt, Tutankhamun. Tutankhamun means the living image of Amun, the son of Amun, the son of God, the child of God, God's son. Now, I'm going to have to miss a load of this out because we're just not going to get to it. It also shows us that Lord Paikal was a god of goodness with wings. And there we have him. He's actually getting up out of the tomb there. We can see his feet here, his 2 feet, his legs, his 2 arms. He's got a bird's head and a bird's beak. He is the feathered snake, Quetzalcoatl, as I mentioned earlier. He's got 2 wings here. This is the tomb itself. This is the shape of the tomb in Palenque when you walk in, the limestone beams. He's getting up out of the coffin and he's bowing to the audience beneath a lotus blossom. He's got the wings of a bird at the front, the claws. He's got the angel's wings, and he's got the head of the bird. And if we turn the angel of goodness upside down, we come up with the bat god, which is the angel of badness. So all of these pictures can be reversed. What's good becomes bad, and what's bad becomes good. That doesn't mean that bad is good or good is bad. It means if you think about the worst day of your life, when you were on the floor crying because you'd failed an exam or you'd failed your tests or you lost a child, you thought that day would never end and you were in tears and in pain. But now you survived, and today you're in this lecture and you feel so much happier today looking back on that awful moment. If you look back on the nicest moment in your life, The sun was shining, you were walking through the fields with a new partner, the birds were singing, and then you find yourself here. Not quite the same. So what was good makes you feel bad, and what's bad makes you feel good. So the good becomes the good, and the bad becomes the good, and the good becomes bad. When we look at decode the Mosaic mask, we come out with the God of the north, the God of the east, the God of the west, and the God of the south. And in Revelations, it says, I saw 4 angels coming from the 4 corners. And I saw a 5th angel, and the 5th angel said, do not hurt the earth, nor the sea, nor the trees, until we have sealed the servants of our God in their foreheads. And I heard that the number of those that were sealed were 144,000 of all the children of Israel. And that's telling us about the 144,000 on Lord Pacal's head. Now, Giles Healy was an American, and in 1947 he was married to a Lacandon Indian in the rainforests of Chiapas in Mexico. And eventually he won the confidence of the Mayas, and they took him to their temple in the jungle. And there were drawings on the temple, on each of the walls of the temple. And this is one of the drawings, originally painted, now faded very badly. And the archaeologists who say that these people swung about in trees, as I mentioned earlier, and ate bananas, they say that this must be a group of dancers dressed up as alligators and monsters. Okay. Now, we know better than that, because we know, again, the resolution's awful. Can you see this cross here? Can you see that? Maybe it's the way I'm looking at it. There's a cross there, and we all know what the cross is, don't we? The cross represents the sun. God is the sun. That's the cross. That's where the Christian cross comes from, the sun, the 4 sectors of magnetic field. So let's try our decoding technique on the sun. And I know that this picture is about Jaipitotec, or Kamashkli. Jaipitotec was like Jaitikutli, we saw earlier, with a brazier on his back. He was a god of sacrifice and skin and foreskin. When victims were sacrificed by the Aztecs, they took their skin off and put it over their heads like gloves. And Jaipitotec was the lord of those who had been sacrificed, and also the lord of hunting. He was a god of hunting. So if we color a few areas in, there's the cross of the sun. Start off with the sun to see what we've got. Put one on top of the other to start with, just to check again. So there's nothing there except the original picture. Use the sun as a center of rotation and swizzle it around, like so. And there we have a man called Jaipitotec. And we see that he's got I'll put a clearer one on in a second. He's carrying 2 sticks. He's got a foreskin hanging down between his green skirt. He was a god of fertility. So we see his skin, a god of skin and sacrifice. He's got a vessel on his head where he carried the seeds of fertility. And his chest is formed by 2 stags with horns. They've got 3 horns each. There's one stag's head pointing that way. There's the other stag's head pointing that way. And they've got horns on. So this is a god of fertility, Jaipitotec, the god of skin and foreskin, who was also the god of hunting, hence the association with stags. Now, the stag is associated with the sun because it sheds its antlers every year. And Jaipitotec is associated with the sun. Now, here's another one. And this one, when we put the transparencies on top of each other, we come out with a picture of Chimalma. Now, there we have the washerwoman at the back. Just a moment. Here we have the washerwoman at the back with her arms folded. She's got a skirt on. She's got one of those rags the Mexican wears on their heads. And in front of her there's an enormous head there. And the guy's standing like that looking at us, with a big head and his arms back like an arrow. Now, she's got twins in her belly. Now, Chimalma was the mother of Quetzalcoatl in Mayan mythology. Chimalma got pregnant when she swallowed a jade bead through an Immaculate Conception. Chimalma gave birth to the twins, the bright and morning star. When she'd given birth to the twins, she was walking through the woods one day and she came across a warrior, Mixcoatl. He fired arrows above her head to frighten her so that he could sleep with her. He fired some beneath her legs, and she bowed her head to avoid the arrows that he fired. And so we see Mixcoatl shown as an arrowhead bowing down to convey part of the story. So here we have the story. This is all from the tomb. This is all from Lord Pacal, don't forget, of Mexico. So there we have the transparencies again. So again, we're being told that the guy in the tomb was born through an Immaculate Conception. Now when we have a look at the next picture from the mural at Bonham-Pack and put them on top of each other, we're told that the guy in the tomb was born in a stable, surrounded by animals with horns. And this picture shows Kamashli, the god of hunting. And we have two midwives here, one on either side, restraining the mother of Kamashli. She's being restrained in the center. Out of her womb comes an animal with two sets of horns down here. So she's giving birth to the stag with two sets of horns, or two stags, and she's being licked by the stag on her head. This tells us that this guy who was born through an Immaculate Conception, you can see it a bit clearer there, hopefully. So here we have one midwife. There's another midwife. Here's the mother of Kamashli in grey with her legs open. Here we see the head coming out with brown horns and pink horns, the two stags. And here we have the stag in the stable licking the mother during the painful process of childbirth. Now this is at 9 degrees, the 999. And this is the picture without the colours. The next one, I'll just show you, go straight to it. Now the two stags shown in grey here are holding up Jaipitotek, and his legs are crossed and his arms are crossed, and he's holding two wooden sticks. His face is like the lion, the mane of a lion, and the lion in ancient mythology, it was associated with the sun. So this tells us that the two stags who are holding up this guy by the elbows with two wooden sticks tells us that this is the man who died on the cross made of two wooden sticks. So here we have the two stags. Can we see that? Okay. And then the final picture in this sequence, we have the two stags applauding Jaipitotek, who was half stag, half man. Here we have the two stags applauding him. Jaipitotek comes out at the end of the performance with his two sticks and bows to the audience. And that's the end of this show. Because these are like plays. They have a beginning, a middle, and an end. And they all come out at the end and bow. Just like the man in the tomb, the mosaic mask, we saw him at the end bowing. It's a sequence throughout the whole production. And this is at 66.6 degrees, those transparencies. That's the number of the beast in Revelation. He who has understanding, let him count the number of the beast. It is 666. Now, here's another one from Bonham-Pack and other paintings. And again, this is where the archaeologists went badly wrong. This is where they took the wrong turn. They walked into this chamber and they said, gee, look at all these guys. They've got blood dripping from their fingernails. These must be prisoners. And these must be the kings who have captured them and cut their fingernails off. Wow, these people were animals. Well, it's not quite like that. If we take one of the drawings here, and then we see the blood dripping out a bit better there. Now we take the sketch. This guy's lying back. And those are the so-called kings with animal skins over them. If we put whenever we get these dots here, these are epicenters, 1, 2, 3. On his arm, again, the resolution's no good. We've got 2 dots there. These are epicenters for different pictures. So when we put one on top of the other, like so, what we see now is that it's not war. What we've got is this guy's washing this guy's hair, this guy's washing this guy's hair, this guy's having oral sex with this guy. So it's making love, not war. So it's the entire opposite of what they... But they don't want the archaeologists to figure these. Archaeologists don't believe in God. You don't want archaeologists going to heaven, do you? The last thing you can afford when you're writing this stuff down is to allow people who are profane to get to heaven. And going back to what we said earlier, why didn't God make us all look the same? Like the Model T Ford concept. It makes sense. Because if we all looked the same, your kid would look like next door's kid. And you might love next door's kid by mistake, thinking it was your kid. So then you get to heaven by mistake. And that's not allowed. So God said, let's make everybody look different, because then you'll love your kid. And there's nothing in the Bible that says you've got to love your kid. The Bible says you've got to love your neighbor's kid. And say anything about your own kid. And if next door neighbor's kid looks like you, we got a real problem. We saw the mask there, the feathered hat, and then we have Tutankhamun with his wife Ankhesenamun on the back of the golden throne in his tomb at the Valley of the Kings, wearing the same hat. And Tutankhamun, of course, the son of God, was the feathered snake to his people, just as Lord Paikau was a feathered snake to his people. Tutankhamun has 26 bands on the front of his headdress, and he was a feathered snake. And then we have the sun, just like the Mexican sun shield, which has got the 1366040 encoded into it. This is the eagle and the snake, the feathered snake, which is God. Now, Lord Paikau, the name derives from Pascal, which is a Catholic word for Easter, because Jesus died at Easter. And as we start to investigate all of the evidence from all of these civilizations, we start to get a clearer picture of what's going on. Now, James Churchward was an American, and in 1927, he was an explorer. He was working for the British as a secret agent in Brahmaputra in Tibet, in India. And he went to a monastery, and the monks in the monastery showed him some ancient tablets called the Nacal tablets, made by the Nacal people 25,000 years ago on the lost island of Lemuria. And the monks said to him, look, this is what the tablets mean. That's the sun, and the sun changed its radiation, and it heated up the land, and the land sank beneath the waves, and 25 million inhabitants of Mu, or Lemuria, were lost. And if we look at the sun, we see the warped neutral sheet of the sun for the first time. Now, these tablets are 25,000 years old. Here we have a snake on the face of the sun representing the neutral warp on the sun that we saw earlier, the model of the record. If you remember, we had the record there with a warp on the side of it representing the neutral sheet. So it seems that not only could the feathered snake represent in a simple way the soul in the air, the feathers, and the snake on the ground, it looks like they were trying to tell us the feathered snake relates to the neutral warp on the sun. And all of these people associated with the feathered snake, here we have Tutankhamun with a ring of sunflower seeds. The sun is the feathered snake. And what we're told is that if we calibrate or if we change the energies in our body, we have chakra centers here, and these chakra centers all spin at different rates. The ancient Sanskrit Indians described them as wheels. We now know them to be the endocrine centers, like the pituitary, the pineal, and so on. And Madame Blavatsky, a Victorian esoteric seer, noticed that the petals, the base chakra, for example, had 4 petals. The sacral chakra center had 6. The solar plexus, 10. The heart, 12. The throat, the pituitary gland, 16. and the crown chakra 96. And if you add all those up, it comes to 144. The brow chakra has 96, and the crown chakra 1,000. So if we add up all of those centers, it's 144, and multiply them by the top one there, it's 144,000. And ancients believe that if we can get the energies going up the body, then we create a halo. Those are the chakra centers. And if we can get the energy going up the body and up the spine, we get energy coming out of the crown chakra at the top. And this is why in ancient pictures they're often represented with halos, different sorts of halos. And only Jesus has the halo with the cross of the sun behind his head, because only Jesus is the sun. You'll find the saints have different types of halos because they're not as pure as Jesus was. And what we find is that when men ejaculate sperm, they lose a great deal of protein, because sperm is about 99% protein and zinc. And one of the problems with reincarnation is if you have children and you don't go to heaven, then you come back as your children's children, because the DNA is the same and the voltage is the same. So if you don't have children, A, there's no body to come back to, so that makes it difficult to reincarnate, which is good, because you go to heaven. And the thing is, this is why priests have to be celibate. This is why Moses said in the Bible, take the foreskins off the babies. Circumcision, which stops them masturbating, stops them getting rid of the sperm, because as soon as you get rid of sperm, all the energy in the body goes to the gonads to make more sperm, instead of going up the spine to make voltage to go back to God. In the same way, women who love their baby send all their energy to their child, and instead of the energies going up the spine and amplifying, they go down, and it stops them getting to heaven. Earlier we saw the importance of the number 9. Tutankhamun's tomb has 99999 seals, and he was born in 9 coffins. And here's a picture of Tutankhamun going to heaven in his burial chamber at the Valley of the Kings. Here we see Tut meeting Nut, the goddess of the night sky. So he's going to heaven. And then we see Tut as 2 twins, embracing Osiris, the twins, the morning star and the evening star. When Tutankhamun died, he went to heaven. He was resurrected in heaven as the twins, which means Tutankhamun must be the same, another reincarnation of Jesus. And if you go down to Peru, what you'll find is that the ancient Incas had many stories. For example, one of them says, by Cieza de Leon, a Spanish writer in the 16th century, he said, before the Incas had ruled or even been heard of in these kingdoms, the Indians relate a thing more noteworthy than anything else. They say there suddenly appeared from the south a white man of large stature and authoritative demeanor. This man had such great power, he changed the hills into valleys, and from the valleys made hills, causing the streams to flow from living stone. They called him the maker of all things created, prince of all things, father of the sun. He did more wonderful things, giving being to men and animals. By his hands, very great benefits accrue to them. This is the story the Indians themselves told me, who in turn told it to their children, handed down through ancient times. They say he travelled along the highland route to the north, working marvels as he went. And they say they never saw him again. They say that in many places he gave men instruction on how they should live, speaking to them with great love and kindness, telling them to be good and do no damage or injury one to the other, but to love one another and show charity to all. They called him Tiki Viracocha, and they built temples to him. The huge statues in the village of Tiahuanaco in Bolivia are held to be from those times. After a long time, they saw another man who looked like the first, but they don't mention his name. They have it from whoever they talk to that he could heal the sick with his bare hands and restore sight to the blind by words alone. Thus he was loved by everyone. Working miracles, and by his words, he came to Canas near the village of Kasha. The people rose up against him and threatened to stone him, but he sank to his knees and raised his hands to heaven. They then saw fire in the sky, which seemed all around them. Full of fear, they avoided him, and they asked for his forgiveness. They regarded this as a sin for doing what they did to him. And they say further, leaving the place where this occurred, they came to the coast, and there, holding his mantle, he went forth amidst the waves of the sea and was seen no more. And as he went, they gave him the name Viracocha, which means foam of the sea. Now, there are lots of stories like this about the two white men who walked through Peru performing miracles in olden times, around 500 AD. Viracocha means foam of the sea. When I lived in Cornwall many years ago, I put my Wellington boots on and walked in the water because I couldn't understand why they would call him foam of the sea. And I walked in the foam of the sea, and I thought, well, what's happening to me right now? And I stood between the foam of the sea and the shore. And then I went from the shore and I went into the water away from the foam of the sea. And when I was in the foam of the sea, I thought, well, right now I'm in touch with the earth beneath my feet, the air, the sun above my head, and with the water. I'm in the foam of the sea. I'm in perfect balance with everything, the earth, the fire, the air, the water. If I move to the land, I am no longer in perfect balance with all four, because I've lost contact with the sea. If I step into contact with the sea, I lose contact with the land. So I'm not perfect. The only time I'm perfect is when I'm in the foam of the sea. So what were they trying to tell us? The Indians believe that the cow is sacred because it gives holy milk. And the foam of the sea is clearly a metaphor for the perfect human being, he who is in balance with nature. And the Indians, in worshipping the cow and Lord Krishna, which means Christ, the Christos, because Lord Krishna was born, and he was said to be like all of the other supergods. I'm trying to connect. I've got to cut out large chunks of this lecture because, as I say, it takes 16 hours in a good day. But the Indians believed heaven to be a milky ocean, the foam of the sea. And that's where God lived. And they believed that when we died, we went to the foam of the sea. Now, in 1988 in Peru, there were lots of reports about some tombs that had been discovered. And one of the tombs contained a figure of the man in the tomb in the guise of a crab. Now, the crab is an animal that lives on the land and in the water. The crab lives in the foam of the sea. And so, in 95, the first book I had published was The Mayan Prophecies. And I did all the sunspot stuff, how they understood how the sun was affecting life on Earth. Although I couldn't understand how they could have done it, that was it. I thought, well, they must have been very clever. But then I started to think, well, nobody could do this sort of thing unless they were superhuman. So I thought there has to be a connection here. Maybe everybody, as we mentioned earlier, wasn't clever in those days. As we were talking about, had I made a mistake in saying that everybody in Israel were clever in the year 0? Well, it wasn't. It was one man. And in the same way, everybody wasn't clever in Mexico. It was one man, Lord Pacal, who was clever. And, of course, Pascal is a Catholic word for Easter, which tells us that Lord Pacal was associated with Easter, as was Jesus, who died on the cross at Easter. So I started to have a look at Viracocha. And he was the Peruvian, I call them supergods, this holy energy that comes to earth periodically. And there were two supergods discovered in Mexico, one at the top of the pyramid and one at the bottom of the pyramid. There was Viracocha and Viracocha Pachacamac. Viracocha Pachacamac was the god of the world. So one arrived in about 350 AD, the one at the top, that was Viracocha Pachacamac. The one at the bottom of the pyramid, believe it or not, was Viracocha, foam of the sea. So you say, well, how could they build a pyramid in layers every 50 years, and the guy at the top be at the bottom, and the guy at the bottom be at the top? Well, of course, the first will be last, and the last will be first from the Bible. And this is what they're trying to tell us. In fact, there are tunnels connecting these levels together. So they put the top body at the bottom and the bottom body at the top. Again, to convey all these messages. And all of the treasures of Viracocha are contained in his tomb at Saipan in Peru. For example, the number of the supergods we saw earlier when we had the matrix 1, 1, 1, 1, 1, 2, 2, 2, 2, 2, 3, 3, 3, 3, 3, all the way down, and then at the bottom we had 1,366,560. That was on level 9 when we added up all of those cycles. Here we see we've got 9, the straps of the coffin are held together with 9, 9, 9, 9, 9, which again is the number of the supergods, which tells us that the men in Peru were, like Lord Paikal, a supergod. And there is Viracocha Pachacamac. And that's a picture you saw briefly earlier on with a bat mask over his face. Now the bat brought death. So, and he's got feathers on his head. So we have the bat mask and we have feathers on his head like Quetzalcoatl. Quetzalcoatl was the feathered snake. The feathers and the snake of Egypt, Tutankhamun, were the feathered snake of Mexico, Quetzalcoatl. Also the feathered snake of Peru. We have this same theme coming through, whereby the feathers epitomized the spirit in the sky, and the snake represented the body on earth, or the body on the ground. And if we look at all of the treasures from the tombs in Peru, we start to see all of the super science of the sun, I call it. Here we have the sun, with the north pole of the sun here. Don't forget the north pole. This north pole here goes around every 37 days, but the equator goes around every 26. And once we start doing the calculations, we can work out different cycles of the sun. And here we see the 4 sectors of the sun, the positive, negative, just as we have on here. These are all treasures from the tombs of the bat god, the god of death, the god of darkness, the solar wind. There's a solar wind, which we got from, this is from Mariner 2 spacecraft, this plot that we saw earlier. As the sun rotates, every 7 days we get 7 days positive radiation, negative radiation coming from the sun, 7 days positive, 7 days negative, 7 days positive. This was discovered by Mariner 2 spacecraft in 1962. And if we take a plot from the sun, using a computer, we can see the protons coming off the sun for 7 days, then we see the electrons coming off for 7 days, then the protons, but because these two are going around together, but then they lose synchronization with each other, what we find is that after a month, this one, the blue one, has slid backwards by 90 degrees against number 1. So as it's moving backwards, it's like a mixer, and we don't see field number 1, we see garbage. So that month, all we get is garbage. What we should get without the North Pole is 7 days negative radiation coming off the sun towards the Earth. Then as the positive sector goes by, we should get 7 days positive. Then as the sun spins around some more, we get 7 days negative, because the sun is spinning all the time and it takes 28 days to go round. But what we've seen is when we have a look at the interaction, is that because the North Pole slides through field number 1 during a month, what we saw was, as they both go round, this blue one is going backwards through field number 1. So during field number 1, the radiation goes through number 1 and stirs it up like a spoon. So the radiation coming off the sun is number 2, 3, 4. The next month we go through the next quadrant. The radiation coming off the sun is 1, 3, 4. The next month it's 1, 2, 4, and the next month it's 1, 2, 3. So we have 4 codes of radiation caused by these 4 fields. These are pieces of jewelry which show the sun carved into 4 sections. That's not very clear, but it's black, and white there. So they're trying to teach us what I call the super science of the sun. And if we now look at the picture of Lord Paikal, and we look at the small man with a hat, I call this guy here, because he was found in the tombs in Peru, in Viracocha Pachacamac. There was two Viracochas, Viracocha and Viracocha Pachacamac, at different levels of the pyramid in Peru, at Saipan. And this, when they reconstructed it, with all the bits they found, they reconstructed this model of Viracocha Pachacamac, who they call God of the World. And he's got these feathers on his head. And in the tomb with him, with these small representations of this small man with a hat, and the small man has corks hanging from his hat. Because he's telling us that Viracocha is on earth in the place of flies, the place of filth. If we look at Viracocha now, and compare him to Lord Paikal, who came from AD 750, here we see the little man across his bat mask. He's got the bat mask across his face, so we can understand this Mexican picture now, because it's very similar to the one in Peru, even though there's 300 years between them. We see the small man here, with his arms in the air, and the small man's got a perfect heart. And the corks on this guy's hat correspond to the teeth on Lord Paikal's face. It's telling us that Lord Paikal was a reincarnation of Viracocha Pachacamac, the man from the tomb, that's the bottom of the tomb. He was also a reincarnation of Viracocha, who came 200 years later from the top of the tomb. It's telling us it was the same guy. And Lord Paikal has the 144,000 carved on his forehead. And the 144,000, of course, was the number of those who go to heaven when they are pure. In the Bible it says, you'll know the ones going to heaven because they've got 144,000 written on their foreheads. That's in Revelation. So if you remember the two transparencies from earlier on, we put them on top of each other here. We rotate them like this. We saw the picture of the man with the bird on his head, which was there. And we saw the picture 1440, 1440 backwards, 00, 144,000. And the Bible says, you will know the ones going to heaven. They will have 144,000 written on their foreheads. That's what it says in the book of Revelation. You will know them when you meet them, the ones going to heaven. And here we have Lord Paikal of the Maya, the leader of the Maya, buried in the tomb in Mexico with 144,000, 144000, backwards 144000, written on his forehead. He's got a small baby bird on his head, which is a quetzal bird, brightly coloured feathers. And he's got the small man with a pure heart from Peru. And there's the small man with a pure heart telling us that the way to heaven, if you want to become one of the 144,000 here, you've got to have a pure heart. Then you'll become a bird, a baby bird, and go to heaven. So it's all interesting stuff, isn't it? Now, as I said, I'm actually going very, very slowly because of the equipment, because it's so bad. And what we know, briefly, is that Qin Shi Huangdi, the first emperor of China, of unified China, had two dragons. His emblem was two dragons, and the dragons carried the sun, or Venus. In fact, two dragons carry the twin planet Venus. And Qin Shi Huangdi, the leader of the Chinese in 220 BC, was shown as a stag carrying a pearl and an eagle and a snake, the feathered snake, Quetzalcoatl of the Mexicans. He was the eagle in the sky, like Tutankhamun, and the snake on the ground on earth, and he was also a stag, and he carried the seed of knowledge. We saw earlier how Lord Paikal was a stag, and he bowed to the audience, and he had two stags applauding him either side. That was from the mural of Bonampak in Mexico. This now is from China, of a different time period. In Mexico we were looking at 750 AD. This is 1,000 years earlier in China, which tells us that the emperor was the stag and the feathered snake, which is exactly the same as Lord Paikal of Mexico. It's exactly as Tutankhamun, who was a feathered snake. So what we're being told is that all of these guys kept coming to earth. Jesus came to earth many times. He came to earth as Lord Krishna 2,500 years before BC. He came to earth. If we look at the terracotta warriors of China, I'll just digress slightly. I'm trying to take out chunks of the lecture to get to the points because we just won't have time. But Qin Shi Huangdi, the first emperor of China, lived around 220 BC, before Christ, and he built the Great Pyramid in Xi'an, in China. They say he was a tyrant, but he wasn't, of course. He was a reincarnation of Jesus, just like all the other supergods, I call them. One of the books I published, which isn't here, from 1997, called The Supergods, showed that these people were gods who came to earth to teach us about spirituality. And they came several times. Jesus came back several times. First of all, he came in around 3000 BC as Krishna, the Christos, the Christ. And each time he left the same messages behind. Krishna came back 8 times. The 9th time he came back as Buddha. So we know Buddha is a reincarnation of Krishna. But the ancient archaeological treasures from around the world of the sun-worshipping civilizations of Earth, we're talking about the Egyptians, the Peruvians, the Chinese, the Celtic people of Ireland, they all worship the sun because they understood that the sun created fertility on Earth. Every time the sun goes round, every 28 days, females menstruate. And this is why the sun is associated with fertility. But of course, the North Pole is moving backwards. As that's going around every 28 days, the North Pole takes 37 days to go around once. So we're getting a mixing up of this radiation from the sun. And if we look at the shapes of these faces, the archaeologists say that the face shapes correspond to a different word in the Chinese alphabet. And if we look at the words, we come out with this phrase: focus the eye on the soldiers in the covered tunnels. These are the terracotta warriors at Xi'an. Read the meaning of the national Chinese characters differently. Use your mind to understand a story which spans from the beginning of time until now, a story about the sun and God. And if we look at the tombs and the layouts of the tombs at Xi'an, for example, this one as an example, what we see is that we have a chariot here, for example. This is a chamber number 3 at Xi'an, where the terracotta warriors were found in 1974. It's full of soldiers, and here's a chariot. I've just simplified the diagram a bit here. Now, the resolution's not good enough on there, but if we were to take that chariot straight out, the wheel would bang against the wall. So they're trying to tell us something. In order to get this chariot out of the ramp, up the ramp and out of this base, the soldiers' barracks, this is a barracks for the soldier. In order to get the chariots and the horses out, we've got to turn left. Otherwise, we're going to hit that wheel on the wall. And they're trying to tell us, if we look at it, full of soldiers now, here's there's 4 horses and a chariot here. If we come out of the ramp and turn left and go left, that's what they're trying to tell us. These are the formation of the soldiers in the tomb, life-size soldiers, the terracotta warriors, in one of the chambers at Xi'an in China. And if we try to make sense of that and reconcile it, what we see is 2, 3, 4, 0. 2, 3, 4, 0. There are 2 soldiers here, 3 soldiers there, 4 soldiers there, no soldiers here. If we go counterclockwise, follow the chariot out of the underground chamber. 2,340 revolutions of the planet Venus, which is 584 days, is 1,366,560 days, which is the same number that we had in the Matrix from Palenque in Mexico. Lord Paycal at the bottom, we had 1,366,560 days, the birth of Venus number. Here we have 144. Here we have 0. There's no troops here. 2 rows of 10. 144,000. 144,000. 144,000 These are the ones who will go to heaven. In the book of Revelation, it says in the Bible, those with 144,000 carved on their foreheads will go to heaven. And that's why the picture of Lord Pekal had 144000 on his forehead. Now, I also went down to Bolivia. This is when I was doing Viracocha, and had a look at all of the archaeological artifacts in the museum. And there's a picture of Viracocha. This is a statue in a temple of the Kalasasaya, one of the temples. And this is a statue of Viracocha with a male in his right hand and a female in his left. And again, we can have a look at what that's trying to tell us. So that's the picture of Viracocha. We take the mirror image, of course, just like all of the others we've been doing with these They all use the same technique. So that's Viracocha. Take the mirror image of Viracocha. The instructions are all contained in this. Put one on top of the other. Excuse me. Okay, just a sec. Let's go back to that one. Viracocha has a picture of a male in his right hand, standing up, and a picture of a female upside down, facing downwards, going down. If we follow those instructions, this is from Tiwanaku, the gateway of the sun, a picture of Viracocha, the sun god. If we follow those, take a picture of the man, which is there. So we start off in that position. It says, take a picture of the man, and these are instructions. Then take the mirror image. That is the mirror image. Then turn the woman, that's the female, opposite the man. Have a look at the picture. Turn one into a female, the opposite of a man. It's now a mirror image. Turn the female upside down. Put the female on top of the male. And now we see Viracocha with his tongue out, which was the mark of the sun god, and one eye open. And when we move the transparency slightly, his eye closes and the other eye opens, and his tongue moves to the other side of his mouth. When we move it back, just on this epicenter here, swizzle it back again, we lose this eye opens again, and the tongue moves to the other side of his mouth. This is telling us, if we stand in front of the gateway of the sun at Tiwanaku, and close one eye at a time, we can measure the angle of the sun. And what they're trying to tell us is that the Earth tilted on its angle because of the sun. In other words, whenever the sun changes its angle, the Earth tilts on its axis upside down and causes earthquakes. And this is why the Mexicans believed that the Earth would destroy itself on 5 different occasions. And we are now living in the 5th age of the sun. This is the sun shield of Monte Olban, which is in Mexico. Here we have 85 loops, 4 arrows, and 11 pendants. And if we multiply 4 by 85 by 11, we come out with 3,740. If we multiply that by the number of days in a year, 365.25, we come out with the same number of the sarcophagus in Palenque, 1,366,040. So, there has to be more to this than we imagine. So, if we put them both together like this, to start off with, I call these pictures Maya transformers, because they transform into other pictures. And we put them upside down like this, we come out with a picture of the gateway of the sun at Tiwanaku. Now, we can see the gateway at the top here, with this particular architrave is carved. And we see the reflection in Lake Titicaca here. And we see a triangle here, which will, when we put that onto the computer and flip it, it'll give us a Star of David, the mark of Judaism. Down here we've got a character. He's actually leaning down, looking at us like this. And this is the Mayan god called Jaitikutli. There's his eye. his eye, his triangular nose, and he's got a helmet on his head. We saw him earlier when we saw the picture of the feathered boy with a hat, and we had the picture of Jaitikutli leaning down with a vessel of cremation. They used to cremate people on his back. So this is from Monte Olban, Mexico. It's showing us a picture of Tiahuanaco in Bolivia, which is thousands of miles away. And when we start to decode the sun shield of Monte Olban in Mexico, when we put one on top of the other, we see the Star of David here, there and there. This is one here. You can only do the other one using a geometric line drawing once it's on the computer. You can't actually see it on here. There's a picture of Viracocha, this one off the gateway is there, the one we've just had a look at. And here's a Star of David representing Judaism. And in here, the carving of Viracocha has a star in his mouth, actually in his mouth. And if we have a look at some other pictures from the sun shield of Monte Olban, we've got a square here which represents Viracocha, the Peruvian god Viracocha. And here we see Lord Pacal, where the two interlocking circles, the Vesica Pisces, which is a mark of the fish or Jesus. We see Lord Pacal there regurgitating a pearl from his mouth. So he's bowing to the audience, as we saw him earlier in the mural from Bonampak. We saw him come out on stage at the end. The two stags were applauding. Here we see him again on this sun shield of Monte Olban with this distinctive hairstyle, regurgitating the pearl that was in the seashell at the tomb at Palenque, showing us he was been reborn. And here we see the brain of Lord Pacal inside his head. We actually see the different lobes of the brain and the different hemispheres here as he bows to the audience that we saw earlier. And if we look at the geometry, what we see is that each of these angles are 60 degrees, 60 degrees, 60 degrees, which is 666. But the other triangle, therefore, if it's the mirror image, they're telling us to do the mirror image here. We've got the gateway of the sun at Tiwanaku. Take the mirror image, we therefore come out with 999. So when we put one on top of the other, we come out with the Star of David. This is a story of the Star of David, or the Jew who reincarnated at Tiwanaku. And if we look at Lord Pacal here and the Star of David, then we had the Vesica Pisces inside the sun shield of Monte Olban. So we start to bring all these pictures together and we start to get more and more evidence which tells us that Viracocha, or the man from the tomb at Peru, Viracocha is foam of the sea, was the same man as Lord Pacal of Mexico and the same man as Jesus. And as we start to move the transparencies around here, now what we find is this is the head of a Jewish guy here. He's got like a headdress on. There's his mouth. He's got two eyes saying, come and listen, I want to talk to you. There's his right eye, his left eye, his nose. Above his head here we have a character embracing that square, and in the middle we have a little baby, and the baby has a square. That's the square of the Freemason. And the next picture we see, there's the baby. You can see the baby's head, his eye, his nose, his mouth, his shoulders. We next see the baby here with his arms folded, with a cross, forming the Christian cross there. And then if we look at all of the different pictures here, the light created by the light, we come out with the Freemason compasses, the cross of Christ, and the square of virtue, which is, again, all worshipped by the Freemasons. And this tells us that all of these pictures of Freemasonry and purity, that we've been born here to purify our soul before we go to heaven. If we look at the mask again, there we see another pattern. He's got his two arms up like that, and he's holding his head like that, and it's the face of Jesus in the middle, and he's got the cross, the wooden cross across his forehead there. Let me point out his eyes. There's his right eye, his left eye, his tongue is out here, just like the Mexican sun god. This is the Vesica Pisces, the mark of Christianity. If we take a picture of that, that's the sketch we're looking at, with his tongue out here. I'll go back to it in a second. 2 crosses, his hands on his head, which is there. Can you see it? Again, it's a lousy projector, so this is giving us problems. He's got his tongue out like the sun god from the Amazing Lid of Palenque, and like the sun god from the Aztec calendar. And we notice that he's got loops around his head, and these are the loops from the sunspot cycle. And what we find is we have the entire Bible carved into this picture from Monte Alban, the sun shield of Monte Alban. And here, if we look closely, again, it's pretty awful. Let me show you the composite picture first. What we have is a bat here, with his eye, and he's on a cross. This is the cross of Northern Ireland, or the Freemason, the Red Cross. It's not just a 2-bar cross, it's a special cross. And here we have Jaitikutli, the god of fire, with his helmet. They used to cremate people in his helmet, on his back. They set fire to them and burnt them. God of sacrifice and fire. So he wore a helmet to keep the heat off his head. We saw him earlier. Here we see his eye, his nose, and his two ears. Like he's got a hole in his earrings there. And that we can see here and here. So Jaitikutli is bowing down. He's got the brazier of cremation. That's this thing here. That's in yellow. And inside the brazier, we've got a sacrificed bat. Now the bat was a god of death for the Mayas and the Peruvians. And his wings are stapled to the cross with 2 drawing pins. And he's hanging from the cross. Now, with a better projector, you could see that there. There's the head of Jaitikutli, the god of sacrifice, with his eyes, nose. Here we have the brazier itself. There's the cross going up there and around there, down there and around there. And the crossbars are across there. Here's the bat. Looks a bit like a mouse with his 2 eyes and his wings hanging down. So this tells us that Jaitikutli was the god of sacrifice for the Mayas who lived where this mosaic mask came from, at Monte Alban in Mexico. Okay, thanks. Right. Okay, we've only got 15 minutes left, unfortunately, and we have that much left. So there's no way, I'm afraid, we're going to get through it. But if we look at the bat on the cross there, we come out with a face here, and we come out with the face of Jesus with this white shroud over his head, the man from China that we saw earlier from the Chinese tomb, and we come out with a Mayan priest. That's when we zoom into the bat god on the cross there. You can just see the bat and its 2 eyes and its nose and its mouth. And then we'll just do one more from the mosaic mask, because these are hundreds and hundreds of pictures, not just 1 or 2. This is why they're living miracles. Here we see another arrangement, and it shows a cross here with the head of Christ on the cross, and he's cross-legged, and he's on top of a bat. There's the bat god with a V-shaped bat, the god of death, with his wings open. There's the set square of the Freemason, which Jesus is carrying, and the compasses of the Freemason are above his head. They're all contained in that picture. And this tells us that Jesus was a Freemason who died a pure person. In other words, the bat is the god of death. So he was a pure person who went to heaven. And there we can see a picture from the Bible Moralice in France from the 13th century. We see Jesus with the Freemason compasses designing the universe. But you can't see them on that picture because it's poor quality overhead projector. And there are lots of other pictures in the sunshield of Monte Alban in Mexico. And again, if we put the acetate, the transparencies at 66.6 degrees and move them together, we come out with the stag. And the stag with horns was another portrayal of Lord Pacal, the stag, because the sun goes around the earth goes around the sun every 365.25 days. And the stag sheds its antlers every 365.25 days every year. So the stag became associated with the sun. And because Jesus was the sun, he had a halo. The stag is represented as Jesus, as Lord Paikal, as Viracocha from Peru, as Qin Shi Huangdi from China. It's all the same guy who keeps coming back to Earth, reincarnating over and over again. And if we go back to the two heads on the amazing lid of Palenque that we saw earlier, when we put the noses together, we see that one of the carvings in the tomb at Palenque had this mark on its nose, and that mark tells us how to put the transparencies together, how to break the code of the amazing lid of Palenque. That was the carving over the tomb of Lord Paikal at Palenque. And here we have it again. We have Lord Paikal facing each other, the two heads there. There's one head with his mouth and his eye, the mirror image, his mouth and his eye, like that, and the bat covering them, which tells us that Lord Paikal designed the sun shield of Monte Olban. And if we move the transparencies again to this position, we see a small man exposing himself here with a cloak going like that. And we see a bat underneath him. There's the bat. I've separated the two there. And this tells us that those who live a bad life will go the way of the bat, and the bat lives in darkness. And here we have this arrangement here of squares, and what we see is 3 squared is 9 in the middle, 4 squared is 16, 9 times 16 is 144, and those are the ones who will go to heaven. So this tells us, in the Bible, the book of Revelation, it tells us that those with 144,000 written on their foreheads will go to heaven. So we see in all of the artifacts from the Mayas, whether it's the mosaic mask of Palenque, which showed Lord Paikal with a small bird on his head, the bird of purification, bowing as the two stags, which was the mural of Bonampak with 2 sticks. And the 2 sticks they used to rub together to make fire, so that's why he was a god of fire. We haven't even started. Oh yes, we did this was one of the pictures you haven't seen from the mosaic mask of a snake with wings, the feathered snake, because they believed Quetzalcoatl was the feathered snake who lived on the earth, the snake, and in the heavens. Okay. Now, this is another one which I only decoded about a year ago. And it's probably the most wonderful of all the pictures because it shows a soul actually going to heaven. Here we have an eagle, like a 747 aircraft, flying towards us. And he's got a bead in his mouth. And here we have one of the men from the tomb in Peru, a small man with a hat, I call him. And he's got a crab across his face. Remember, Viracocha was the foam of the sea, the guy who was not in the sea and he wasn't on the land. He was in the middle. He was in the foam of the sea. His name was Viracocha. Here we see Viracocha with his wings out going to heaven. And we see a man here, that's his face red, with the compasses here of the Freemason, which tells us that when these two transparencies are placed 99.9 degrees together, that says 99.9, that says 99.9, we come out with this composite picture here, which shows the man from Peru with the small hat that we saw earlier, and this tells us that the man in Palenque was the same man as the guy in Peru. So all of these ancient treasures, throughout history, there have been many incarnations of Jesus on earth. First of all, he started off in 2500 BC as Viracocha, foam of the sea, as Krishna, Lord Krishna, the Christos. Then he came back as Tutankhamun, the son of God. Then he came back as Lord Buddha, the perfect one. Buddha and Krishna, well, Buddha was the next incarnation of Krishna. That's what the Hindu believe. Then he came back as Qin Shi Huangdi, the first emperor, who was the feathered snake. He was the sunspot cycle. It looks like a feathered snake. Then he came back as Jesus around the year 0. Then he came back as Lord Paikal, as Viracocha around AD 300. Then he came back in Peru again as Viracocha Pachacamac in AD 500. Then he came back at Palenque in AD 750 as Lord Paikal. And throughout all of these incarnations, he encoded all of these secret pictures into his treasures to tell us how to get to heaven and how to escape going to hell when we die. And the messages of all of this stuff is that if we are pure and we can purify our spirit, we can increase the voltage of the soul inside our bodies so that when it's time for the body to die, the soul releases and escapes the earth's gravity and goes to heaven and becomes one with God. And God is electromagnetic energy. The Bible tells us that. God is light. So if we can increase the voltage of our soul by loving each other, then when the soul is released from the body, we'll go to heaven and we'll find peace again with God. If that doesn't happen, if we don't love our neighbor, then the soul will not reach the required voltage to leave the body. And when the soul leaves the body, it will attach itself to a new set of developing genes, whether it be a flower or a dog or a pig or a human being, commensurate with the voltage it generated during its last lifetime on earth. So if when you're born you're a real mean person, then you'll come back with a low voltage. And when your soul leaves your body, when they put you in the coffin, you'll come back as a rat or a dog. You'll come back as a lower voltage creature. If you're a good dog, your voltage will increase. When that soul leaves the dog's body, it will come back as a chimpanzee, which is more intelligent. If you're a good chimpanzee, you'll come back as a human. If you're a good human, when your soul dies, you'll go back to God. If you're a bad human, you'll stay on the earth because you won't have enough voltage to escape, and you'll come back as a lesser creature with a lesser voltage which is coming from all of the cells in your body put together. Now, as I say, this stuff takes about 18 hours, and I've just been told I've got 8 minutes left. So, we've had terrific problems with the equipment today, and I can only apologize about that. I think, as you know, Bob Brown isn't here, and Bob understands my requirements exactly, but they're having difficulties. But it's very difficult to convey this stuff with high-tech equipment. All I want is a nice projector. That's all I need. Right? Once you start getting clever, you've got problems. Because God doesn't want us to be clever, he wants us to love each other. You see, when we love each other, the voltage of the soul gets greater and greater and greater. It's as simple as that. We're electromagnetic energy. If when we start off as 3 volts from God, the more we love, we get a halo. And it gets bigger and bigger and bigger with each incarnation until we've got so much light coming from us that we escape the earth's gravity and we go to heaven and become one with God again. God is light. God is electromagnetic energy. But the books are available, and I don't advertise because I think this work is meant for certain people, and those people will come across this work come what may. The website's up and running. There's lots of stuff on there of a lot of interest. www.mauricecotterell.com. You can order the books from the American publishers or off the internet. They've been around now since 1995. There's 2 books here which aren't shown, the Mayan Prophecies and the Supergods, but they're out of print and they're not available. All of the others were published by the Americans, so they're still in print. I can't show you, unfortunately, the pictures of Jesus and King Arthur and all the rest of it because we've got no time left. If I hadn't had the problems with the equipment, I could have got up to Jesus and the Holy Grail, which is a wonderful story. The Holy Grail is alive and well in Ireland. It's there's no question about it. The same energy, the godly energy that produced everything that you've seen, produced the Holy Grail. And it's a story, it's worth reading. You can get all of the books off the internet, Amazon.com. Just look up my name and it'll come up with all of the books. And it's wonderful. One of the problems with having a short lecture is this. If I give a 16-hour lecture, there are no questions. If I give a 4-hour lecture, there are 7 days questions. If I give an 8-day lecture, there are 3.5 days questions. If I give a 12-hour lecture, there's just 2 of questions. And right now, you're going to have a lot of questions, because I'm not even halfway through the overheads. And this is a reduction of what I normally have. So it's very difficult to explain this stuff. One thing's for sure, you were meant to be here this morning and you were meant to see this. I just think it's a great shame that you can't see all of it, because it's just beautiful. And there's no question that we've all been here many, many times before. We have many incarnations. And Jesus' story was very simple. Love your neighbour and you'll go to heaven. We love each other. The voltage inside gets bigger and bigger and bigger. We get a halo, and eventually the halo is so powerful it will escape the Earth's gravity and go back to God, who is light. We'll become God again. But it's very difficult, because everything we see around us is illusion, Maya. That's what the word means. We think we see individuals when we're actually all the same person. We're here to love each other. As long as we love each other, the voltage gets greater and greater and greater. And eventually we become light beings. Now, once you start to understand all this stuff, you'll understand, because this is a UFO conference, it's very interesting, because not only are you open-minded, but you'll understand what UFOs are, why we have them. All of this information comes together, and it all starts to make sense. But the bottom line is that you are all God inside. We all have a soul. The body is the devil, 666. We're made of carbon, the carbon atom, which has 6 electrons, 6 protons, 6 neutrons. We're the body. The physical earth is made out of 666. God, the soul around us, is 144,000. And that's the speed of light. I haven't got time to tell you that, but that's the speed of light. You need to read Bruce Cathy's books. And I suppose, being a ufologist, you'll have heard Bruce Cathy, who does a lot of stuff on UFOs. But all I can say is, have a look at the books. They're all published by American publishers, Inner Traditions. They're all on the web. I've tried to make them stand alone, because the Celtic Chronicles, which was the last one to come out last summer, is all about the Celtic people who had exactly the same beliefs as the Egyptians, who had exactly the same beliefs as the Incas, who had exactly the same beliefs as the ancient Chinese. And they had the same beliefs because Jesus has been back to earth many times as different leaders. It's the same guy. And we can prove this as the lecture goes on, that he must have been the same guy. But for now, I'm afraid we're out of time. So, I'm sorry.